Developed as the state-owned Tillings response to the Leyland Atlantean and the Daimler Fleet Line, it's a bus that didn't have the happiest of births, and through no fault of its own became something that it actually wasn't originally designed to be. But despite all this, it went on to moderate success and in latter years has achieved a bit of a cult following. Join me then as we travel on a journey into the history of the Bristol VR. In the 1960s, Bristol Commercial Vehicles were building the Bristol Low-Decker and were looking for a replacement for this. When the low-decker had been introduced in the 1950s, it was a very cutting-edge design. It allowed a low-height bus with a full-height layout, with the gangways in the centre of both decks. The introduction of the rear-engined Leyland Atlantean in 1958 and the rear-engined Daimler Fleet Line in 1960 had pretty much rendered all front-engine designed buses obsolete. Especially in 1966, when one-person operated double-decker buses was legalised. So by the mid-60s, Bristol were looking at designing their own rear-engined double-decker bus that was suitable for one-person operation. Now before I continue, it's worth just having a quick look of the politics at the time of Bristol Commercial Vehicles. The Tilling Group had been nationalised in 1948, and this includes not only Bristol Commercial Vehicles but also Eastern Coachworks, the bodybuilder at Lowestoft as well. This had resulted in both manufacturers being unable to sell their wares to the open market. This was until 1965 when the government invited Leyland to take a 25% stake in the companies, and this allowed Bristol and ECW to sell on the open market once again. Bristol Commercial Vehicles were already building the Bristol RE single-decker, and with access to the open market now, this was proving very popular with lots of different customers as well as with lots of different bodybuilders. So when it came to designing their new rear-engine double-decker bus, Bristol wanted something completely different that would appeal to a wide range of customers rather than just the former captive audience of the Tilling Group. So instead of having a transverse engine across the rear of the chassis, Bristol decided to have an inline engine situated in the off-side rear corner of the chassis. The chassis was originally going to be called the N-Type. This was later changed to the Bristol VRL, this being the position of the engine, vertical rear and longitudinal. The chassis had a flat low frame all the way through, which would have allowed a flat stepless floor on the bus. This design feature following on from the FLF type Bristol low-deckers. It was also designed that it could take double-decker or single-deck bodywork with up to 3 doors at the front, the middle and the very rear. In 1966, 2 prototype double-decker buses were unveiled. GGM 431D was the first one and was originally in Central Scottish red and cream. HHW933D was the second Bristol VR prototype, and this was delivered in Tilling green with a Bristol scroll on the side, although it saw use in Mansfield with Maidstone and District. Both buses were bodied by ECW, and the design had a lot of parts in common with the FLF type low-deckers. As is usual for prototype vehicles, they experienced teething problems and spent certain periods of time out of service. Eventually both prototypes passed to Bristol Omnibus, and eventually after that passed on to Osborne's of Tollesbury in Essex. Before all this though, in 1968, as I mentioned in a previous video, the government introduced the bus grant. This would give any operator 25% off the price of a new bus as long as it met certain requirements. Some of these being that it was suitable for one-person operation, and when it came to double-deckers that it had to have a transverse rear engine. Now obviously this sounded the death knell for the Bristol VRL. Bristol couldn't hope to sell as many without the carrot of the 25% discount dangled in front of the bus operators. And this led to a radical redesigning of the Bristol VR. So where did this lead for the Bristol VRL? Was it a total waste of time then? At the end of 1968, a very sleek double-decker coach Bristol VRL appeared. This was destined for Ribble's subsidiary Standerwick coaches. Ribble had been looking at replacing its existing double-decker coaches based on the Leyland Atlantean. So they ordered a fleet of 30 of these impressive Leyland-engined coaches. Apart from 25 chassis produced for South Africa which were bodied as buses, no more Bristol VRLs were produced. And so, as I mentioned previously, Bristol were left with no alternative but to turn the engine 90 degrees and place it across the back of the chassis with the gearbox, in a similar style to the Leyland Atlantean and the Daimler Fleet line. This became the VRT, the vertical rear transverse relating to the position of the engine. There were no prototype VRT chassis built. The first ones were for a batch for Eastern Scottish on a long wheelbase chassis. Going straight into production of the VR without any prototypes and any tests done on it was a bit of a mistake on the part of Bristol Commercial Vehicles. But they were up against the clock and, to be fair, probably didn't have an awful lot of choice. It's fair to say there were a lot of problems with these early Bristol VRTs. In fact, things were so bad that Scotland decided to swap their very early Series 1 VRs for late model Bristol low-deckers from the English MBC fleets. But Bristol were watching and listening to the feedback. Not only from Scotland but also from the English National Bus Company fleets that were operating the early Bristol VRs. In 1970, Bristol released the Series 2 Bristol VRT, which was a revised chassis and helped address a lot of the problems operators had experienced. I interrupt your viewing pleasure to bring you yet another advert. And again, it's a bit of self-promotion. For many years I've been helping to organise the Thanet Vintage Bus Road Run. The run was started in 2008 by a lovely guy called Mick Martin, and was initially a recreation of the old open top route around the coast of Thanet. This year, which is 2024 for those of you watching in real time, I've decided to go for a different format. We will be operating a small network of routes using vintage and lots of vintage buses and coaches. The hub for the network will be the Spitfire and Hurricane Memorial Museum at Maidstone near Ramsgate in Kent. And we'll have routes serving Ramsgate, Broadstairs, Margate, Westgate, Ramsgate, Minster, Cliffsend, and a feeder bus to and from Sandwich as well. There's no need to book and riding the buses is for free. But we do have a voluntary collection for a local animal charity, Cats in Crisis Thanet. In 2023 we raised £800 for them from generous donations of the passengers on the buses. More information and timetables will be loaded onto our Facebook page. Just search Thanet Vintage Bus Road Running Day. See you on Sunday the 14th of July. Now back to the main feature. When the Series 2 Bristol VR was introduced, there was very little to show the difference between a Series 1 and a Series 2, as a lot of the changes were actually under the skin of the bus, so to speak. Externally though, the rear offside upper deck drain slot had been moved forward and there was increased ventilation to the engine, and this was via a newly designed three-piece engine cover. Underneath all this, a fan had been fitted in the engine compartment to assist with cooling, and transmission components had been modified and updated to improve reliability. It was about this time as well that Bristol VRs started appearing wearing different bodywork to the standard Eastern Coachworks design. Both Sheffield and Merseyside ran buses with bodywork by East Lancs coach builders. The first 59 buses for Merseyside were a long wheelbase VRT design, whilst West Midlands ordered a huge fleet of 200 MCW bodied Series 2 Bristol VRs. Now the interesting thing about the East Lancs and the MCW design was that they both featured a bustle at the rear end that made them look kind of like a Leyland Atlantean or a Daimler Fleetline. Another bodybuilder entered the foray, which was Northern Counties of Wigan. Northern Counties bodied Bristol VRs for Gallagher and Reading Borough Council. The Reading ones were on a long wheelbase chassis. The Northern Counties bodywork didn't feature a bustle and was flat at the rear end like the Eastern Coachworks bodywork. The formation of the National Bus Company in 1969 saw both the BET Group and the Tilling Group pooling their assets together. One of the most visual things to come of this was the fitting of the BET style curved windscreen to Eastern Coachworks bodywork at the time. This was fitted across the Bristol RE, LH and VR range. On the VR, this added an extra 2.5 inches to the length of the bus overall, and was introduced from 1972. Around this time, Bristol and ECW introduced several more variations on the Bristol VR theme. Most of these were related to the bodywork though. One of these was an ultra-low version of the Bristol VR, and it was fitted with special decambered springs which brought the height down to 13 foot 5 inches. The standard low height body on the Bristol VR was 13 foot 8. The Bristol low decker meanwhile was 13 foot 6. So the extra 2 inches of a standard height Bristol VR could be the difference between getting under a bridge and not getting under a bridge, hence the ultra low version being produced. Towards the end of Series 2 production in July 1975, another variant was produced, and this was the full height 14 foot 6 Eastern Coachworks bodied Bristol VR, and these went to Maidstone and District. In August 1974, Bristol produced the prototype Series 3 Bristol VR. Bristol Commercial Vehicles, perhaps having their fingers burnt going straight into production of the VR in 1968, actually produced 2 prototypes and 12 pre-production chassis of the Series 3. All were bodied by Eastern Coachworks, with one of the prototypes going to Western National and the other one to Northern General. The pre-production buses joined the fleets of Southdown and Hanson Dorset in 1975. The most obvious difference between the Series 2 and the Series 3 was the air ducting and trunking at the rear of the engine. Anticipating future noise legislation, Bristol had tried to encapsulate the engine as best as they could. This resulted in the high-level intake and outtake for the air, as well as sound deadening trays actually underneath the engine, although a lot of these were later removed to aid accessibility for maintenance and servicing. Power steering was now fitted as standard, and gone was the hydraulic throttle. This had been replaced by an air-operated throttle. Out of all the marques of Bristol VR, the Series 3 was the most popular, with the most buses being produced. The Series 3 also produced another version of the bodywork, with Eastern Coachworks and Alexander producing a convertible Bristol VR bodywork. This meant that buses could be open-topped for the summer and re-roofed and run as conventional closed-top buses in the winter-time. The Series 3 also saw 2 more bodybuilders join the foray into body in the Bristol. One, as I mentioned before, was Alexander, and the other one was Willowbrook of Loughborough, who built a limited number of buses for the National Bus Company, for East Kent and Northern General, as well as a small batch for Cardiff. Now I'm just going to touch on the subject of the engine options available for the VR. When it was first announced, the options of Gardner 6LW and 6LX and 6LXB were included in the range, as well as the Leyland 0600 and the Leyland 0680. Interestingly as well, the original specification also allowed for the fitting of an AEC AV691 engine. Although in reality all the Series 1 and Series 2 VRTs were fitted with Gardner 6LX and 6LXB engines, although it would have been interesting to speculate what an AEC engine Bristol VR would have sounded like. Series 3 buses had the options of a Gardner 6LX and 6LXB, as well as the Leyland 500 series turbocharged engines, although the 6LX engined option was withdrawn in 1976. In late 1980 there was a disruption to the supply of Gardner 6LXB engines, and Bristol Commercial Vehicles managed to obtain a few 6LXC engines and some Leyland 500 series engines, as well as some 0680 engines, and these were fitted to some of the Bristol VR Series 3 chassis around this time, most notably those for Southdown and Bristol Omnibus. However, bus companies like their standardisation, and most of these Leyland units, including the 500 series and the 680s, were replaced by Gardner 6LXBs. A later life modification would see Pottery's GRF705V have its Leyland 501 engine replaced by a 10 litre Cummins L10 engine, and that would retain that engine for the rest of its life. Now, I've not come across any videos on YouTube of it running, but that must have sounded amazing, to be fair. There were several gearbox options available as well, which would give the Bristol VR a range of speed from 35 miles an hour all the way up to nearly 60 miles an hour. Although from my personal experience I can relate to driving a Leyland 501 engine Bristol VR, and that went an awful lot faster than 60 miles an hour, and is probably the reason I have so much grey hair now. The first Leyland Olympian prototype appeared in 1979, and the production models started to enter service from late 1980. Those early Leyland Olympians were actually built at the Bristol Commercial Vehicles plant in Bristol, and indeed some were actually taxed as Bristols. After a run of 13 years, the Bristol VR production was ceased in 1981. The last bus for the National Bus Company being VEX294X for Eastern Counties, which was appropriate as it was the closest operator to Eastern Coachworks Bodyworks. The last VR of all, though, went to a surprise operator, Stevenson's of Sparth, and that was UVT49X. This bus later passed to Midland Fox and then on to Crosville, Wales. It entered preservation for a little while, but then was sadly stolen and presumed scrapped. Like lots of other National Bus Company buses, the Bristol VR became very hot property during deregulation. They were used to compete against new operators. They were used by new operators to compete against, in some cases, their original owners. The Bristol VR also made an appearance back in Scotland again. Lowland, Kelvin and Gaelic Bus, to name a few that started operating second-hand Bristol VRs. Perhaps proving to the Scottish that the Bristol VR wasn't that bad. Many Bristol VRs have also been open-topped, which has also extended the lives of them somewhat. Of course, this is in addition to the ones that were built brand new as convertible buses. And open-top Bristol VRs, indeed Bristol VRs in general, aren't just to be found in the UK. They have been exported all over the world, America, Australia and Europe, and most places that you go to, you will not be too far from a Bristol VR. A number of former buses have been turned into exhibition units and cafes. And again, this does tend to extend the life of an old bus. In fact, 2 of the Bristol VRs that I own were former exhibition units. And of course, the Bristol VR has proved very popular in preservation circles as well. Now, when you consider there were 4,474 Bristol VRs built, you compare that with the amount of Leyland Atlanteans and even Leyland Leopards, and there's quite a sizable percentage of Bristol VRs in preservation today. Unfortunately though, as is always the way, most of them would have gone off for scrap. And a lot of the scrap buses would have been parted out to provide bits and pieces to keep the other Bristol VRs on the road. I hope you enjoyed this double-deck omnibus version of Classic Bus Histories. If you did, please like and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any further uploads in this series. And talking of which, there will be further uploads which will include the Daimler Fleet Line and the Leyland National. Stay tuned. Bye bye.